and I hand over the word to Gonzalo.
Thank you very much, Juan. As always, it is a pleasure for me to be with you today as well. And today we have to say something. Let's see if it's interesting about abundance and the idea of unconditionality, right? They are very closely related because without unconditionality, there is no abundance, right? So, of course, we also remind you that we will talk about abundance from a new context of reality that we have already explained sufficiently, right? And which is a more spiritual and less materialized context, right? And as always, the first thing we have to say about it is that whenever we learn to live from the soul, we will have abundance guaranteed, but not from the ego, right? Because the ego is related to the finite, right? And the soul is what is related to the infinite, okay? So the first thing we need to say is that abundance is the natural state of the universe. And that abundance is only sometimes limited for us because our filters, that is, or they could be dirty, right? And our need to learn certain internal values that we will now explain and that, in my opinion, guarantee abundance. Well, we still haven't achieved it for whatever reason, because that's why we are here, to learn, right? But we do need to know that abundance is the natural state of the universe. When we don't feel that we are in abundance, is because there is some flow within us that we still need to correct, right? I also want to say that abundance does not only refer to having enough economic resources, right? But abundance affects other types of human outcomes, right? Such as the resources necessary to live a dignified life, the quality of human relationships, health, and adaptation to the environment, right? Such as external results that we have already discussed in other talks. And it also refers to internal results of peace, happiness, and spirit of service, right? So abundance is something broader. Let's say that simply economic resources, although it includes the idea of having enough economic resources to have a dignified life, right? And I also want to say here that we should not confuse abundance with poverty or with austerity, right? Because we need to use language properly, because if not, language affects our minds and we can become confused, right? Let's see. Abundance is a spiritual virtue. Austerity is a spiritual virtue. But poverty, that is the absence of necessary material resources for a dignified life, is not a spiritual virtue. It is an egoic limitation, right? And we also have to learn to get out of it, don't we? You see, on one occasion, I asked Mother Teresa of Calcutta how many resources had she received throughout her life, right? She replied, laughing, that many millions. But the thing is, she hadn't spent them on hairdressing, right? But it's not like he didn't obtain those resources, right? Gandhi never starved to death, and Jesus Christ even less so, right? Everyone invited him to eat or stay or sleep or whatever, even if only to listen to him speak. What I mean by this is that high levels of consciousness, which we already covered in a previous course, and I won't repeat because otherwise there won't be time for the rest of the abundance session, always have abundance guaranteed, right? You will not find anyone at the fourth level of consciousness having difficulties in living. I don't know if I make myself clear, right? In having their most essential needs in life covered, right? Because in addition, high levels of consciousness are very efficient, right? And the least efficient things that exist, as you know, are war, corruption, legal insecurity. In short, all those things are typical of low levels of consciousness, but not of high levels, right? For example, I'm going to give you an example of what I mean, right? Because sometimes examples help, right? Look, on one occasion, I intervened in a situation where, for some reason, a swamp had to be cleaned, right? And of course, three bids had been received to clean the swamp. Two cost 25 million euros and were based on classical technologies. And one, which was chemical, and I don't know what, was only 3 million. Well, one of the reasons the government did not choose the 3 million one is because, of course, since it was a much lower price, their 10% commission was also lower, right? So in order for the government to charge a 10% commission on the 25 million, people had to pay 18 million more than necessary to clean a swamp, right? That is obviously not an efficient management of resources, is it? But that's what's done from lower levels of awareness, isn't it? So, all right. As always, abundance is it's a situation that reflects our internal state, right? And therefore, we have to suggest a series of internal values that will guarantee us the let's say, external manifestation of abundance, right? And we have to say that the most important value in this sense is what we call unconditionality, right? Whoever puts conditions on their service or actions is closing the door to abundance. And then the law, it will teach, right? How putting conditions on our behavior, our service to others, and so on, will have repercussions on our own abundance, right? The first thing we are going to do, if you agree, is that I will suggest that we all examine ourselves, right? In how we have developed 8 values that I am going to talk to you about, which in my opinion are the 8 internal values, right? That, no, it's not that there can't be a 9th, of course, right? But the ones that I find most, 8 most important internal values that would ensure us, right? That the law of the universe would guarantee us abundance. Remember that everything happens by law, right? And therefore, when we want something in life, we must align ourselves with the law for it to happen, right? Okay, let's see. The first value, right, that we have to talk about of when to talk about abundance, it is the same value that we explain for building human relationships from love and not from ego, right? And that value is trustworthiness, right? And reliability has, as we said, 2 aspects. One aspect is self-esteem, but the other aspect is making ourselves trustworthy to others, right? And for that, remember, we said we have to work on calming, right? Our emotional and sentimental body. Because without a calm emotional body or without a calm sentimental body, we will never be reliable to others, no matter how honest we are. You know what I mean? Others must be able to express themselves with us. They have to be able to, well, talk about their problems without us overreacting, right? With the mistakes of others, right? Because if not, they won't come back to us to ask us for our opinion or help with their difficulties or their problems. Therefore, the first value I want to highlight that we need to develop, right, if we want to be abundant, is it is the internal value of reliability, right? The second value I'm going to suggest is enthusiasm. Okay, enthusiasm, right? Enthusiasm is the fuel of action, right? For action to work, enthusiasm is the fuel. Notice that when I was much younger and studied at Harvard, we were taught everything about managing time, right? About being efficient in time management, right? When now the new paradigms, even in business schools, right, it's no longer about managing time. It's manage your energy. Of course, within managing your energy, it's necessary to manage time well. But it's not just about managing time, right? we have to manage our time and energy well, don't we? So, since we are multidimensional beings, right? If we want to be abundant, we have to learn to manage all our energies well. So, physical energy, well, through rest, proper nutrition, exercise, or whatever. Emotional energy, right? Keeping emotions calmer. The mental focus, meaning, do we have our mind focused on what we are doing or wanting to do? Or is our mind always scattered in 50,000 different situations, right? That do not run, that have nothing to do with the project we have at hand, right? And above all, also the spiritual energy, being aligned with the law of the universe, and above all, with the law of love, right? Which is the most important of all. Therefore, enthusiasm and energy management go hand in hand, right? Because whenever there is energy available, it is much easier to generate enthusiasm. And as we all know, it is much more difficult to generate enthusiasm when we have no energy, right? The first thing that declines when we don't have energy is enthusiasm, right? And when we lack energy, we need to try to see at what level we are managing ourselves well, right? We might be managing well spiritually or mentally, but of course, if we don't rest enough, we won't have energy, because even if the meaningful aspects work, the fundamental anchor, which is the body, doesn't function, right? So that management of energy has to be multidimensional, just like the human being, right? Of course, this is a little more complicated than just time management, but it's necessary, because we can be managing time well and at the same time losing energy, right? Because we're not managing the energy itself, right? And therefore, it's the second internal value that I believe we must learn to develop, right? Okay. And the third internal value that we need to develop is our capacity for commitment, which leads us to give our best in everything we do, right? Let's see. In the world of matter, there is no independence. What exists are processes of giving and receiving that are governed by law, right? I'm going to give you an example that happened to me in life, which I believe made me understand this very well, you know? And I think it might help you too, right? In my professional work, which was in the financial market, when I was still working in the business world, I was dedicated to managing the money of everyone who had money, you know, or a lot of money. And on one occasion, I had a client who was a multimillionaire and owned 300 or 400 restaurants, you know? And one day while having lunch with him and chatting, he told me about his life, right? And he said to me, look, Gonzalo, I am a lawyer. I graduated as a lawyer. What happened is that, well, very young, at 20 years old, well, I had a girlfriend and we made a mistake and, well, she got pregnant, what we call a penalty pregnancy, right? Well, he says, and of course, as soon as I had, I'm telling you, as soon as I finished my degree, well, of course, I was in a big hurry to be able to buy diapers for my son, you know, of course, because there was no other choice, right? He says, and then I started urgently sending resumes to all the law firms to see if any would hire me. He says, I saw how some of my friends or classmates who even had worse resumes than mine, right? And worse grades in the degree and worse preparation, well, they were hired and I wasn't getting any offers. Until one day I got an offer to be a waiter, right? And I thought, hey, but if I studied law and such, how am I going to work as a waiter, right? I want to work as a lawyer, you know? But he didn't have any offers to work as a lawyer and had to start working as a waiter because I insist he had to buy the diapers for the baby, right? So he tells me, the only thing I did right in my life at that moment was, instead of going to work frustrated and upset and without motivation, I said, hey, if I have to work as a waiter, then I'm going to give the best of myself as a waiter and wait for life to bring me the job I want as a lawyer, right? And that's how it was. And he says to me, look, a restaurant hired me that was a bit down and such, but well, I started being very nice to all the customers. even suggesting to the chef some dish changes, some menu changes, and the restaurant started to fill up and fill up and fill up. And then the owner offered me, of course, the restaurant was already so successful, why not open a second restaurant and name me the manager of the second one? And that's what we did. We opened the second restaurant. I was the manager, and the restaurant was very successful. And after a year and a half, when I had already learned all the restaurant business and how everything worked and so on, I thought, oh, why don't I open one of my own? And then he says, I opened my own restaurant. And of course, all the things I had learned, well, I implemented them as the culture of the new restaurant, just like that, you know? And he says, my son, and right now I have 300 restaurants. I'm a multimillionaire, and thank goodness I never worked as a lawyer. Okay, that's the story this man told me, you see. So what successful action did this man take? What did the universal law respond to? Well, the law put him in a situation to see if he had understood the lesson that we have to give the best of ourselves, even if we are not doing what we most want, you know, and the law showed him the result. And now any lawyer in the world would want to be in this man's position, right? So this shows us how the ability to commit, right, guarantees us abundance, right? And how many times do we make the mistake of not giving our best in an activity because it is not what we want or like, but it's what we have to do, right? And so the law of the universe will always respond to our ability to commit to what we have to do, right? All right. The fourth internal value we need to learn is respect, right? We have to allow others their own destiny experiences if we want to be abundant, and their corresponding mistakes, right? We must have benevolence in that to not lose energy. I also remember an experience of my own here, right? About a businessman who was my client, who one of his employees had made a mistake that had cost the company a lot of money, right? And he told me that they hadn't fired him. And I said, and how and why? And he told me, well, look, precisely because since he already made a mistake that cost me such, I'm sure he won't make that mistake again. And if I hire someone new, they might make the same mistake. So sometimes, you know, no. We do not understand how the law works, right? And respect includes tolerating the mistakes of others, right? Especially when there is a purpose of amendment or acknowledgement of the error in the other, right? And well, respect is opposed to revenge, isn't it? Or to disciplining, right? That is, respect is giving to others just as God gives to us. That's in the Our Father. Forgive us our trespassers as we forgive those who trespass against us. So this topic of respect for others' mistakes is one of the internal values that we have to develop, right? To ensure abundance. The fifth internal value I propose we examine and see how we are doing with it is the value of generosity. It's about loyalty. How loyal are we to agreements, right? Because unilateral norms create obligations, but only bilateral agreements create commitment. So we have compatibility with other people when agreements are made and modified with ease, right? And another, for example, another language mistake that we have to be aware of, right? To avoid making mistakes is that language always speaks of unfair competition, okay? But that is a mistake. I mean, there is never unfair competition. What there can be is an equal competition. But not unfair, because in the competition, there was no prior agreement. Am I making myself clear? Disloyalty only refers to not honoring the bilateral agreements we have indeed reached, right? Love doesn't need agreements, right? But it does require a commitment to oneself, but living together does need agreements, okay? That's why notice that the problem isn't so much with multiplicity. The problem lies in the multiplicity that has forgotten our common origin, right? So it's important to understand this and know what loyalty is, okay? Loyalty is the commitment to fulfill our bilateral agreements, all right? The sixth value that will always guarantee us abundance is service, right? We will talk about it in more depth in the last session, and always, as long as we understand that it is a service without suffering for the one being served, right? To keep our energy, we must realize that the law of the universe always gives more to those who do more, because those who do more are the ones who need it the most, don't they? And the one who needs the most to do his service will receive more, always give to others in our professional relationships what we would like to receive, right? And there is a mathematical formula that I must not forget, right? I do want to suggest it to you, and it is this: right purpose plus right information plus right action equals abundance, okay? Therefore, we have to start by examining our purpose, okay? That is from God. And our intention is what we have to give to God, our purity of intention. Now, the correct information and the correct action belong to Caesar's world. As we already know, we must give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar and to God what belongs to God, because that's what the gospel teaches us, right? For example, I can have all the good intentions in the world, but I don't have the right information to operate on anyone's knee. And therefore, I can't do the right thing, can I? Because I lack the correct information. So I will never be successful at operating on knees, because I'll leave everyone limping, right? Therefore, correct purpose plus correct information, in other words, correct preparation, more correct action equals abundance. Of course, I can be a great knee surgeon, but if I go drunk to operate, I won't perform a correct action, right? My hands might shake or whatever. So remember this: right purpose, more information or right preparation, plus right action equals abundance. And that is guaranteed by law. Sorry for making this parenthesis between the internal values, but I think it was an important point, and I had forgotten to introduce it, okay? All right. The seventh internal value that we need to develop to ensure true abundance is openness to continuous learning, okay? Notice that rigid minds tend to protect or strictly preserve knowledge rather than expand and improve it, okay? To improve our knowledge, we have to maintain an open mind to learning, an ability to adapt to evolutionary change, and above all, learning to distinguish between what is contextual and what is not contextual, right? Because what is not contextual will never be modified by any learning. For example, love, or for example, God, right? But what is contextual, that is to say, not depending on a certain context, it is always open to change, learning, and evolution. Therefore, you know, fear and mental rigidity are really defense mechanisms of the ego that doesn't like uncertainty, opening up to new things, or stepping out of its comfort zone, okay? But to be abundant, many times we will have to be open to leaving our comfort zone to learn new things, no? Especially how, I insist, in the contextual world. And contextual is almost everything, right? Only love and God and a few other things are non-contextual, okay? And that must also be said. Good. The eighth internal value I would like to suggest for our internal examination is whether or not we have a reasonable tolerance for risk, right? Notice that one of the basic needs of the ego, which we mentioned in the first sessions, is the ego's need for security and control. And there is nothing that bothers the ego more than not being able to be sure or not being able to control something, right? However, I always tell my children when it comes to life, my children are all entrepreneurs, and I tell them, look, in life, I've learned that there are three attitudes towards risk. We can call the first attitude the civil servant's attitude, the one who doesn't want to take many risks, who looks to have a fixed paycheck at the end of the month, okay? But of course, it's difficult to achieve great economic abundance from there, you know? Second, the entrepreneur's attitude, who takes calculated risks. And the third attitude is the gambler's, who doesn't even react to risk and makes quick decisions without any foundation. What usually happens in life? Sometimes the gambler, if he gets it right twice, overtakes us all on the left. But sooner or later, he makes a mistake and boom, falls straight down. So we have to learn to distinguish between fear and prudence, okay? Because the difference between them is very narrow, but also really important. Prudence is a spiritual virtue. It's the virtue that allows us to anticipate the possible consequences of our actions before acting, both for ourselves and others. Okay? And this is essential to know because prudence guides us while fear paralyzes us, since fear is essentially the opposite of love. As we have seen also in previous sessions, it is necessary to remember that the player is not afraid, but also does not have prudence. Therefore, it is not the right attitude towards risk, right? Therefore, learning to place ourselves on that razor's edge that distinguishes prudence from fear is truly important for achieving our abundance, okay? And that takes some practice, okay? And it also requires a certain internal adjustment to be at peace, but with a certain degree of uncertainty, okay? This is like the famous saying, God will provide, be calm, that if we generate all these internal values we have talked about, abundance will be guaranteed, okay? And sometimes things happen to us in life, and this has happened to me as a businessman more than once. We think that something has happened to us that is going to be a disaster for our company, our project, or our work. And then after a few months, you realize that a wonderful door has opened, one that at that moment of worry, you didn't have in mind. Does that make sense? Therefore, let's trust in the universe, because I insist, as long as we work on these internal values, our abundance will be guaranteed. And if we're having some problem with abundance, we should ask ourselves, which of these values we talked about here, well, maybe we are not applying them well internally, right? As long as we do not apply them well, the universe will show us the law. And if we apply them well, the universe will also show us the law. Therefore, let's apply what Jesus said. Work internally to achieve these inner values, that everything else will be given to you as well, right? Everything else will be given to you by the law, okay? But sometimes we work too much out there, right? And we forget about the internal values we need to have for the law to guarantee us abundance, don't we? Suffering is the great enemy of abundance, isn't it? Because suffering, as we have said many times, indicates to us. Just as fever indicates that we have a disease in the body, suffering is indicating that we have a disease in the mind, right? Because suffering consumes a lot of energy, and we don't have energy available for enthusiasm, for the capacity for commitment, for service, or for openness to learning, right? These are necessary internal values. So, with this, we've reviewed very quickly haven't we? Due to the time we have. Well, those 8 internal values that I suggest examining to ensure we have guaranteed abundance. We have offered a mathematical formula, right? For abundance, which I think is useful to keep in mind. And we have distinguished so far between abundance, poverty, and austerity, right?
Gus, let's see, another thing I had to change in my way of thinking, right? As a new idea I am throwing at you now, right? As an entrepreneur, it was that, of course, since I did my master's and all that, well, I don't know, for more than 40 years, well, of course, then we knew what we knew, right? And I remember that one of the things they taught us in the Master of Business Administration was to manage, to handle by objectives, to set goals, right? But over time, I have understood that goals can limit abundance, right? Because if we tell the universe what we want is to sell 4 houses a month, well, one might say, okay, sell 4 houses a month, fine, but why not 40, right? So whenever we set goals without realizing it, we might be limiting the abundance of the universe, right? Notice too, that goals are always ego-driven. They come from us, right? And therefore, what I am going to propose to you today in this regard is that you replace the idea of goals or objectives with the idea of purpose, right?
Let us learn to give the best of ourselves.
For example, if we are house sellers, what's the point in setting the goal of selling 4 houses a month? And why not 40? And why not 400, right? I mean by this, that if we purify our purpose, have adequate preparation, and take actions.
And it's better if we stay open to the idea that God sets the goal or the outcome, right?
Because the ego is the one that wants to control the goal. I don't know if I'm making myself clear. While what we need to control is our internal process, right? And already the goal will be set for us by the law. All right, so this is something that was difficult for me, of course, because of the training I had, right? So many years of ideas, of a mistaken idea, correcting it in my mind, you know? But I did it and it worked very well for me in the company. I saw that when, instead of focusing on everyone meeting objectives, I focused on everyone giving their best. And their enthusiasm, commitment, learning capacity, and respect, and so on, increased. Wow, the goals multiplied by 10 without me having to change the goals, right? And that's something that I'm not just telling you theoretically, you know, but I have practical experience, you know, of the matter, you know. What's more, whoever is happy and enjoys what they do will always be abundant, right? Notice that I'm not an expert in Greek or Aramaic because I have no idea, right, about those 2 languages. But I have spoken more than once with people who are indeed experts in those languages. And one of the biblical teachings that I believed had a contradiction was this one, right? And it's important to explain this at this point, you know. Notice that in Genesis it says, by the sweat of your brow, you will earn your bread. But then in the gospel, Jesus says, I come to abolish the Old Testament. Jesus tells us, the sweat of your brow, use it to change yourself internally, then everything else will be given to you in addition, right? So I think, and I have consulted with some experts in the languages, of course, the sacred books were not written in Spanish, but in other languages, right? And they all tell me that the word bread from Genesis may be mistranslated, that what really a better translation would be this, and you will gain wisdom with the sweat of your brow. So, of course, if Genesis replaced the word bread with the word wisdom, then it would already be in perfect harmony with Jesus's teaching in the later gospel. I don't know if I'm making myself clear, right? So this is a matter that I like to bring to light here. For I do not claim to be right in what I say, because I insist I do not know the original languages and I am speaking from third-hand information, right? But I was always surprised that those two teachings coexisted together, right? And therefore, I was very happy when the experts in those languages, and they told me that the issue might be in the translation, right? A bit like what happens with the word sin, because the best translation in Greek and Aramaic for the word sin is miss the mark. In English, miss the target, okay? So sometimes one must be cautious with ancient sacred books because we rely heavily on translations, and translations are not always entirely accurate. This is something I also wanted to clarify for you, okay? Lastly, in the few minutes we have left, we've already talked about what abundance is, right? We've already talked about the mathematical formula, and we've talked about the internal values that we need to develop to ensure it. We also talked about the inconvenience of setting as many goals as we are used to doing, but rather replacing them with a change of purpose and to give the best of ourselves. We have also talked about the possible contradiction between Genesis and the gospel. Where should we work? And where should we apply the sweat of our brow, right? Lastly, and if it seems good to you, I would like to suggest some attitudes or behaviors that will also guarantee us abundance, right? They are no longer necessarily internal values, but they are some attitudes, right? And behaviors that will generate abundance for us. And these are the 8 or 9 that I'm going to suggest quickly, right? The first of these is integrity. We must have an integral attitude in the universe because the spiritual golden rule. And as a businessman, it took me a long time to understand this, but I have no doubt that the spiritual golden rule in this sense is that the end does not justify the means, right? For example, if a person finds a 20-euro bill on the ground after a big conference and everyone has already left, and there's a 20-euro bill lying there and they do this, look up, no one sees them, there are no cameras, boom, they put it in their pocket, right? Without asking whose it is. Sure, he thinks he got away with it, that nobody saw him, nobody is going to report him, right? Well, look, I have an extra 20 euros to spend on a coffee. And what he forgets is that the universe did see him, right? And therefore, those 20 euros that he put in his pocket, that definitely weren't really theirs. It's possible that later it might cost them much more money than that. But of course, he will never be aware of it because suddenly things start getting blocked for him. This and that start going wrong. And he says, well, what have I done for this to be like this? Well, look, maybe you put 20 euros in your pocket that weren't yours because you thought nobody would catch you, but the universe did catch you. And no one escapes karma, right? Therefore, maintaining an honest attitude will help us generate abundance in our life and then not have other things blocked. Okay? Good. Another thing within this idea of integrity is that if we want to be abundant, we must respect the relationship between our compensation and value generation. Okay? For example, there might be a person who tomorrow is appointed as a minister who has no idea about the subject in question and who accepts the position without being prepared for it, collects the salary, and then sits in the office and does nothing more than sending WhatsApp messages and doing meaningless things. And he thinks he is thriving. Okay? It is not abundant because it is not respecting the relationship between value creation and compensation. And the universe will make you pay later, for sure. Okay? Therefore, the rule is we should not charge if we have not created value. Okay? That's a golden rule in the universe. That's within the law of compensation. Sometimes life gives us the opportunity to charge for something without having generated value. Sure. But that's not integral and we'll pay much more money later. Another idea, another important attitude on the topic of abundance, which is also a teaching of the gospel, you surely remember the tithe.
The idea of tithing is to nurture the universe, okay? Not wanting to keep everything in a negotiation, allowing the other to also come out of it gaining something, right? I'm going to give you an example that happened to me in this regard. Once, a client of mine who was a millionaire, multimillionaire, David Robertos, I was traveling in Miami, which is where I used to live, and he asked me if I could accompany him to a video store because he wanted to buy 100 films in English to take them to his country so that his children could learn the language by watching movies and more. Since the shop was 2 minutes away from my house, I said to him, of course, I'd love to, let's go. I'll go with you and translate with the seller and whatever you need. This man, Buffett, who had billions, wanted to push the seller so much on the price. First, it made me uncomfortable. And second, the seller told him, look, I can't sell you the videos because if I'm going to lose money, I'd rather not sell them, right? For this man, paying $2 more per video wouldn't have been a problem by any means. But that attitude of wanting to press the other person, to always gain as much as possible for yourself, it's something the universe will not forgive. There is another lesson from that in the gospel, as you know, referring to the debt a nobleman had with the king. The king forgives him, but then the nobleman does not forgive his servant, right? And the king finds out. And what happens next, right? So in that sense, always lubricate the universe. Let everyone gain something, have their margin, so they can continue with their livelihood, okay? And let's never take advantage of situations where people are a little more pressured at the time, for whatever reason. And of course, if we take advantage of something like that, the universe will never forgive us for that. And we will generate great karma, okay? Okay. Another thing, another attitude we must have in our professional work is not to work for money, like letting money be a consequence of our work, right? Because if we seek money, well, maybe the universe will give us money, but it will not give us abundance. Remember that abundance is more than money, although it includes money, okay? And therefore, let's never work for money. Let's work to grow, to offer something to others, to develop the world, for doing an activity, providing service, or whatever, right? But let's leave money as a consequence of doing a good job, more than as the only goal, right? Because then we won't be abundant, even if we have money, which happens to a lot of people, you know? Let's see. It is also important when it comes to professional work to consider our suitability, okay? Do not perform roles or work that do not match our personality traits because it consumes a lot more energy, you know? So for example, my character or my personality is not suitable to be an auditor, right? I couldn't do it because it's not what I do well comfortably. It's not easy for me to sit at a table for 10 hours looking at a paper. I need to move, create, talk. Well, then each of us has a personality that God has given us, and there are a series of functions that are more or less easy for some than for others, depending on the characteristics of our personality. So the wise people of ancient times always told us, know yourself. Well, this applies here too. I recommend looking at each person's personality. What functions or jobs come more naturally to us and consume less energy, okay? Let's try to focus on those, all right? All right. Another attitude I am going to suggest to you is the famous 80-20 rule, okay? All the professional activity specialists say that generally only 20% of the time we dedicate to our work is really important. And the other 80% is usually spent on superfluous or secondary or unimportant activities, right? And it's that famous book that was written in the United States a few years ago. I don't know if you know it, titled in English, Don't Sweat the Small Stuff.
The book is also translated in Spanish. So, for example, I, having had the experience of being on many international company boards, will tell you what always happens. People waste their time arguing whether the janitor's uniform buttons should be gold or silver. And when the time comes to make important decisions for the company, everyone is so exhausted that there's no time or energy left to do it. So, well, let's focus on what is truly important and be a bit more relaxed, shall we? Let's not sweat the small stuff, okay? Let's see. Another thing we need to understand about our attitudes and our understanding. I say that a company is like an iceberg, okay? You know what I mean, right? The iceberg only has 10% of its mass above water and 90% below water. But that 90% below water is not visible at first glance, like the 10% above water, right? Another of my experiences on the boards of many companies is that everyone deals with the 10% that is above the water, but no one deals with the 90% that is below the water, which is what supports that 10% that is above the water. And so this is a topic to be very clear about, okay? And let's not make the same mistake, okay? Remember that every business group or professional group is like an iceberg. And we have to not only be aware of what is above the water, but also of everything that is below the water that supports all of that. Good. Another important attitude for abundance is to think about solutions and not problems, right? Again, in the board meetings of all the companies I have been in, and I was talking about the problem. And it gets to a point, I always say, hey, do you mind if we start talking about the solution now? Because we have analyzed the problem from 70 angles. Everyone gets it already. So why don't we dedicate our energy to seeing how we are going to solve it, right? Of course, because focusing on the problem won't solve it. Understanding the problem, yes. But focusing on it, no. We need to focus on the solutions, right? Okay. Another thing I'm going to throw at you in the 2 minutes I have left is two more of these important attitudes that I think we need to understand is, let's see that pose, always protect the workers, but do not protect the jobs. I mean, they are different issues, okay? Notice that we have it in Spain constantly. Let's see. As we all know, 20 years ago, we listened to music through cassettes. I don't know if you remember the Super 8, the smallest one, whatever, but cassettes. Nowadays, no one makes a cassette because we have other technologies. We cannot protect the job of a person who makes cassettes because we are not going to sell any more cassettes. It is no longer useful in the world, right? Now, what we can do is protect the worker. Do I make myself clear? And how do we protect the worker? Well, we can train them to start producing MP3 instead of cassettes, or to perform another function, or if they cannot somehow adapt to the necessary productivity, then with an appropriate pension or proper retirement, or even with charity. But it's not a good idea to protect workers by safeguarding obsolete jobs, as is often attempted in society. For example, coal mining. Well, yes, for 40 or 60 years, it has been very important to do coal mining. But coal is no longer desired because, of course, it pollutes. It's dirty. It's not efficient in energy production, and we have to protect the miners, but not the mining. All right? And those miners, well, we will have to retrain them, have them do different kinds of tasks or different types of jobs, right? Now, if we keep supporting mining, we are going to waste money and we won't be efficient. I don't know if I'm making myself clear because nobody is interested in that anymore, right? Okay? And finally, I'm going to tell you something else that sincerely was also very difficult for me to understand, okay? At the beginning of my business career, I remember that When I started my company being the owner, I chose the best resumes, the best records, people from Harvard, from Stanford, from here, from there, with great technical preparation and all that, right? And in the end, what happened? They were destroying the company from the inside because they were very egotistical, because these qualities we're talking about, internal values, they didn't have them, no matter how much technical preparation they had. And what I learned with time, it is that it is much easier to teach the technique at a high level of consciousness. Explain high consciousness to a technician. So not when hiring people or working with others or whatever, always try to select the highest level of awareness, and they will learn the technique. I remember once we needed a cook to work at my house, and I hired a really good one, right? That said, she was an amazing cook, but no one could live with her. The rest of the staff left. No one at home was happy. She was always creating problems, arguments, and all that. And look, you know what? I said, the next hire will be a person of high consciousness, and I'll make sure they learn to cook. And so we will live together with more peace and harmony. And the house will be a home and not a hotel, right? And well, in short, I know I have many things left to say, but this is the time we have. And I think we have said some things that are useful for all of us to improve in our abundance. So thank you very much, and let's open up to questions.
Thank you, Gonzalo. There are a series of questions about abundance.
Of course.
So let's see. Let's start here. Rosa Ugarte asks us this question. She reflects, and he says, I wonder if the universe can forgive our unconscious bad thoughts, those we do not desire, but come to us. I don't know if it's very related to abundance.
Of course. Let's see. Yes. And thanks a lot for the question. The first thing I want to clarify is that a thought is never unconscious. A thought can be involuntary, but not unconscious. I mean, if it were unconscious, we could not know that we have a thought at all, but the universe always forgives us. Although forgiveness does not exempt us from having to pay the consequences of the mistake. I don't know if I make myself clear. It's very important not to confuse God's forgiveness. The love in forgiveness doesn't mean it has something to teach us, right? Forgiveness means that God is not offended, but the learning process will not be left incomplete. Does that make sense? And therefore, does God forgive us? Always, even before we have done anything. That is in principle. I don't know how to explain. Love forgives, right? Now, my child, of course, I forgive everything they do. But I have to teach him at the same time. I mean, forgiving does not mean not teaching. Therefore, even though God forgives us, he will not remove karma, right? Or he will not take away the need to live through the consequences of our mistakes so that we learn not to make them again. It's not a matter of forgiveness or lack thereof. It's a matter of learning.
It's a matter of learning. Laura Cabrera says, Gonzalo, how then to help people we care about who have a lot of disorder in their finances, which keeps them poor, without interfering in their evolutionary path? In other words, how to help them without interfering in their path.
Okay. Look, this is a central topic of the next and final conference. Sorry, second last in this case. It was going to be the last. But since there is now a question and answer session at the end, it's the second last, right? Let's see. This has a very clear answer. The question is very good. Although we'll go into more depth on this in the service, okay? But the answer is clear. You can, you never interfere in another person's destiny if the other person asks you for information or help. You interfere in another person's destiny when the other person doesn't want your help and you insist on helping them to make them learn. In other words, the necessary tool is respect, okay? You should wait for the person to tell you, hey, look, I'm having trouble managing my finances. Obviously, I'm not doing something right because I'm not seeing good results. Well, could you give me some ideas? Or can we talk about it? And then, of course, you give them all the information you have or can provide to help them, okay? If he doesn't ask you for the information, then at most, what you can do is meet him or her one day for coffee as a friend and say, look, well, I actually had some of these problems too. And there was some information that came to me that helped me solve them. I want you to know that you can count on me to give you that information whenever you want, okay? But if he doesn't tell you, give it to me, then don't say anything else about it. Let him have his own experience and faith, because we shouldn't interfere in his destiny, because we cannot take away from people the freedom that God has given them, okay? Moreover, it could even happen that without us realizing, the law of the universe might consider it premature for that person to receive the information at that moment to stop making mistakes, because they still need to cook a little more in the mistake before being ready to take the leap. And only God and the universe know that, not us with our best intentions. So the solution to that question is this. You wait for him to ask you for advice, or you tell him that you've had similar problems in the past, but you received some information that helped you with that, and that you are available if he wants it. And if he doesn't want it, then you respect him and don't interfere in his evolutionary processes.
Here's a very important question, Gonzalo, which we talked about before starting the chat. It's from Gabi, and it goes like this. It says, Gonzalo, what is the poverty of spirit mentioned in the gospel?
Okay, great question. Thank you. Let's see. The poverty of spirit has nothing to do with material poverty. Let that be clear. Okay? The poverty of spirit refers to not having internal attachments to the material. But attachment is one thing, and the lack of resources is another. I can have a large house, but I wouldn't have poverty of spirit if I were attached to the house. That is, if I needed that house for my happiness. Do I make myself clear? The only thing I need for my happiness is to know that I am a child of God, that I am in a process of growth, that everything is going to end very well, that I am a soul. And as the saying goes, no difficulty lasts 100 years, nor does anybody endure it. But poverty of spirit refers to detachment, right? Not to material poverty. That must be understood well, because if not, we're going to mess it up. So poor in spirit is one who needs nothing to be happy, nothing more than their divine affiliation and union with God. Materially poor is someone who does not have the resources to live a dignified life, if you know what I mean, right? To cover the basic needs. I insist, austerity is a spiritual virtue. Poverty of spirit is a spiritual virtue. But material poverty is a selfish limitation. We either lack one of those 8 values, or we still haven't learned well how to be of service. Look, on one occasion, a person came to see me, and he told me the following. He says, look, Mr. Gonzalo, I have worked my whole life in construction, but now there's a big crisis, and I am out of work, and I need to work to support my family. And therefore, I would like to ask you something, if you agree. He says, I am willing to work for you for 2 months without you paying me anything. Wherever you tell me, wherever you need help. During those 2 months, I will demonstrate my values. my dedication, and my attitude. And if you are satisfied with what I do during those 2 months, the only thing I ask is that you then give me a job, or if you cannot directly, that you recommend me to any of your contacts, friends, or people who might be able to offer me a job. And do you know what I did? Hired them on the spot. And he's been working with me for 25 years. Has anyone ever told you that in a job interview? Normally, in the other job interviews I have had, the first thing they did was ask me about the salary, then about the holidays, and maybe as a third step, what the job involved. I don't know if I am making myself clear, right? Okay, so that guy is abundant today, but he handled it differently, right? And so those kinds of people are never going to be at peace, believe me. Now, that's for sure. It must be said that this man is unconditional, and if one day I need help, he is there without hesitation. I don't know if I'm making myself clear. Look, few things bothered me more in my company than hearing a CEO say, today I'm not making the coffee because that's not my job. But let's see. Right now, maybe the person who serves the coffee might be sick. And how many coffees have I already made at my company? Well, as many as needed. Of course, it wasn't my job to make coffee. I was the president. But unconditionality leads me to do whatever I have to do at any moment so that everyone is happy, right? I'm not paid for this. But what an absurd way of thinking is that? I don't know if I make myself clear. You are paid to create wealth where you are harmony. I don't know if you understand me. And the thing is, we need to have a different attitude in the company, right? And that's why I was trying to advise you on attitudes. And one of them is, or the most important one is, unconditionality.
Here's another question about the words of Jesus. And the question is from Maria Milagros, and she asked, how do we integrate abundance with Matthew 19:23, which says that it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven?
Because we have not understood the lesson. I believe the lesson should be understood this way. A rich man with an ego can pass through the eye of the needle. What happens is that all the rich materials of the time were also rich in ego, right? But it's not a problem of material wealth to enter or not through the eye of a camel. Through the eye of a needle. Really, what I understand here is that a person rich in ego can never enter the inner kingdom. That's why we have to transcend the ego to enter the kingdom. In my opinion, it does not refer to material wealth, because conceivably, material wealth can coexist with a poverty of ego or spirit, right? That is possible and has happened in some cases. It is rare, but it happens. Therefore, it is the one rich in ego who will never be able to enter the kingdom. But it doesn't have to be the one rich in material goods, right? It's just that we really need to understand this well, and we have to be a little careful with the translation too, okay? It's like if you were to ask me about what happens with that evangelical teaching where Jesus tells the rich young man, leave everything and follow me. He doesn't say throw everything in the trash and follow me. What he says is detach yourself from everything and follow me. Do I make myself clear? As Latin Americans say, you don't say throw everything away and follow me, but rather let go and follow me, okay? And that letting go means to detach. I mean, leave the comfort of your home and follow me through the desert. Leave this and work with me, you know? But it doesn't say throw everything away. I think we need to understand that.
We need a new language,
Yes,
right?
yes. The thing is the language we have, Juan. And I'm glad you mentioned this because it's something I've thought about many times myself. And I totally agree with you. The language we have is one that has developed in a quite precise way to deal with or manage material or rational things. But language is not rich enough to talk about spiritual matters, right? And because humanity's consciousness hasn't developed collectively either. Individually, in some cases, yes, but not collectively to the necessary spiritual levels. You know, the other day I was reading a mystic that I really like. And he said, one of the most important services one can do in this life is to turn the ineffable into the comprehensible. But he also said that he lacked the language to do it, didn't he? Because what he saw in his mystical experiences was very difficult to explain with concepts or words. Because keep in mind that language is conceptual and words are just symbols trying to represent a concept, right? But when you enter the spiritual world, you are already in the transconceptual. And therefore, there are no words that can yet define or encompass the transconceptual. I don't know if I am explaining myself. And it is true that there is a bit of a lack of language development to refer to spiritual truths. The example I have sometimes given is, if I say the word table, everyone will know exactly what I'm talking about. Yes, it could be a 3-legged or 4-legged table, round or square, but everyone knows what a table is. Now, if I say the word soul here today and ask all the attendees to define what a soul is, you'll see that we won't find two identical definitions. Do I make myself clear? I mean, the words that refer to spiritual realities, we need to improve the language because there are doubts. And that's a great thing you mentioned because it's true.
Here is also a practical question. It might be the last one of this session. And it goes like this. Gonzalo, is there any way to manage fears and uncertainties as an entrepreneur when things are not going well in our company? I guess what you're referring to in the question is that one always feels like balancing things out so they go well and generate abundance.
Well, the first thing I have to say to this person is, welcome to the club. Because as an entrepreneur, I've spent my whole life in the situation you're describing, right? But man, yes, the only way to properly manage fears is to increase spiritual understanding. When you understand that what is going to happen to you is exactly what is good, what you need at that moment for your spiritual growth, then everything is welcome, okay? When there are difficulties in the company, then what needs to be done, in my opinion, is to try to apply everything we have talked about today in this talk, okay? Examine oneself inwardly to see which of these values we have generated or not generated and still need to generate. Let's all take a look inside ourselves to see if we are following these attitudes, right? The ones I talked about earlier. And then maybe it turns out that instead of examining the external, the objective problem out there that is causing the difficulties, we also have to look inside, okay? Like change the polarity of the mind and look internally and ask ourselves, why is the universal law causing us these difficulties? Because it's not by chance, luck doesn't exist in the universe, okay? We made that very clear, I think, in the first session, right? Therefore, I believe that as long as we work on generating these internal values and attitudes we have referred to, we will be in a better position for the outside world to respond to the internal values we are applying, because we will no longer need teaching. And if we do not need teaching, the universe will not create events that trouble us to acquire it, okay? Lastly, I should also mention, of course, that I am completely unaware of the specific situation of the person asking the question, right? But as I said at the beginning of the talk, okay, correct purpose, more correct information or preparation, plus correct action equals abundance. It could be that we are not doing something right. It could be that we are not reinventing ourselves in our business or company at the speed the market requires. I mean, it could be many things, right? But above all, my advice is that whatever happens, be at peace. Because from anguish, stress, and suffering, we will not gain creativity, we will not see solutions, nor will we help ourselves or anyone else. So the first advice is to maintain inner peace. Second advice, turn the mind inward rather than solely examining the external situation, right? Those would be my tips, and I'll be happy to talk to the person in question if they wish, any day they like, via Skype or whatever, to understand their personal circumstances more precisely, okay? Because of course, these conferences are generally guiding, but then you have to focus on the situation and circumstance of each person, right?
And finally, let's talk about some of the things I'm seeing in the chat, okay? Mercedes says, she says that the book Espiritualizarse is sold out on Amazon.
No, sorry, thanks. Because I have to clarify this point, because this is not the first time it's happened to me. Let's see. The problem with the book Espiritualizarse is that we first made an edition with a cover, okay? And then due to some requirements or demands from Amazon itself and some suggestions from other publishers and so on, we decided to make a second edition and change the cover, okay? I just bought 25 copies of the book Espiritualizarse on Amazon yesterday because several people asked me and told me, well, I would be happy to make 25 gifts, right? I assure you that it is available on Amazon, both in physical and Kindle formats. What happens is that sometimes people can get confused because the one that is out of stock is the first edition, okay? So if we don't go to the page of the second edition, it might tell us it's not available. But if anyone wants to get the book, feel free to send me an email and I'll send you the link directly. I can either send the link directly to you, Juan, so you can distribute it, or I can gladly give it to them for free if you tell me where to send it.
Very good, Gonzalo. Thank you. And Fabiola Betencao remind us of the list of mystical readings we mentioned before.
Ah, yes. Sorry, I was supposed to send you an email with that, but I haven't done it yet. Anyway, if you want me to tell you from memory now, I'm happy to do it if we have time. And if not, I'll send you an email, whatever you prefer, okay? Look, let's see.
I mean, yes, of course.
For example, if you are thinking about reading Christian mystics, I recommend to you St. John of the Cross, okay? And I especially recommend Master Eckhart. I think Master Eckhart is the greatest of all of them. Teresa of Avila is also good, but she only reaches the second level, all right? Whereas St. John of the Cross and Meister Eckhart have reached other levels. Additionally, I also once heard Thomas Merton say that Teresa of Avila was first a Christian and then a mystic, while San Juan de la Cruz was first a mystic and then a Christian. And personally, I like to read the mystics. For this reason, I suggest you start with those two first. Oh, and there is another very interesting author, Edith Stein, okay? In a way, she is more modern, okay? I've also always liked what she says. On the other hand, if we focus especially on Western mystics, I recommend Paramahansa Yogananda. He is very good and has written Autobiography of a Yogi, The Second Coming of Christ, and The Yoga of Jesus. They are three extraordinary books for me, okay? I also found another one called Ramana Maharshi. Very interesting, very good. Ramana Maharshi with S-H-I. Another very good one is Nisargadatta Maharaj, who has a fantastic book called I Am That, okay? And you are all going to like it. Another really good one is Aurobindo, who has a fabulous book called The Divine Life, okay? And you might be interested in reading it. And then without being mystic himself, without being mystic, there is a man who has studied, in my opinion, better than anyone else, Mysticism and the Development of Consciousness. And his name is Ken Wilber, with W, Wilber. Many of his books are translated into Spanish, and I highly recommend them, okay? But he's not mystical, okay? In my opinion, it's just that he has understood, as I often say, all that swarm better than any other philosopher. And therefore, it's also good sometimes to listen to technical descriptions of the matter, you know? There is also another interesting Eastern mystic named Suzuki, Zen Master Suzuki, who has very interesting books. Two other simple but very useful books by Anthony de Mello are called Awakenings and The Call to Love. Okay, finally. We have many other possibilities, and I would gladly make you a more extensive list of all of them. But I think with this list I'm giving you today, we have more than enough for now. Okay? There is a father and doctor of the church that I like a lot, who is the first Christian who said, the first Catholic of the church who said, this is a school of souls, right? And his name is Saint Basil of Caesarea. And of course, someone who was also a mystic, that's Saint Paul, isn't it? Saint Augustine, reading Saint Augustine. He is another one I like, although I have no proof that he was a mystic, but he deals very well with the whole issue of reality and God's will. Saint Alphonsus Ligori. I think he has a book called Conformity with the Will of God. Sorry, I don't think, I'm sure. He has a book called Conformity with the Will of God, which is fabulous and very small, only 85 pages. You can literally read it in 20 minutes, but it's great. And let's see who else comes to mind. No, that I haven't mentioned so far. There are a lot, but I think with all this, it's more than enough for now. Okay? And from there, well, everyone else is going to say more or less the same thing, because you already know that everything that rises converges, right? So what Yogananda says is going to resemble what St. Paul says, and it's going to resemble what, right? So in that sense, well, of course, the Vedas and the Vedantas, the Bhagavad Gita, you know, are absolutely necessary reading for anyone who wants to be cultured in spiritual matters, okay? And all, of course, the texts of the Christian mystics I have mentioned, of course. But I think these are all the authors I have read many times and with great attention, and they have helped me a lot. Above all, it has helped me a lot to realize that, you know, everything that rises converges, that we have discussions lower down the pyramid, but not above. The truth is one, reality is one, and we have many interpretations of truth and reality. But of course, love sees everything the same way, right? And so therefore, when the level of consciousness has risen, the intellectual discussion no longer exists. Among other things, because it seems like a rather stupid exercise. That would be my answer. Anyway, I will prepare an email with a list of all these names and bibliography and such. I will send it to Juan so that Juan can distribute it. Yes, because I understand that quickly. Noting everything down with these pronunciations and names isn't the easiest thing in the world, right? But I promise you that before the next talk, that email will be done.
Very well, Gonzalo. Thank you very much. So I think we can end today's talk here. And we invite you all, as usual, for next week, where we will have section 11 on service and the comprehensive practice of spirituality, which will be the last one. And at the same time,
the second last in this case. Anyway, I see that there is a question here. And sorry for a minute, someone is asking. For the first time in my life, I am seeing the chat because I really can't read it, speak, and answer at the same time. Someone was asking me if I knew Stanislav Grof. The answer is yes, deeply. I have read all his books, and I find him a very interesting author and generally quite accurate. He's not a mystic, let's say like Meister Eckhart, right? Or like, he's more of an intelligent researcher. But I think he's a man who's in my personal opinion, I found it interesting to read him, and I think no one wastes their time reading Stanislav Grof.
Very well, Gonzalo. Thank you. Thank you all for your presence, and we'll see each other next Thursday at the same time.
Delighted that. And thank you very much for your patience. See you Thursday.